Let's begin by stating something that might make some people uncomfortable, because truth, by its very nature, is often disruptive. The popular understanding of the rapture, particularly in the modern Western church, is not ancient, it's not theologically foundational, and it's not scripturally airtight. Instead, it's largely the result of cultural influence, historical distortion, and a psychological tendency toward escapism. The rapture, as commonly taught, the sudden, secret disappearance of Christians to avoid tribulation, is more of a theological innovation than a divine revelation. What's critical to understand is that ideas don't just emerge in a vacuum. They are often shaped by the anxieties of the time. The 19th century, especially in the West, was filled with intense cultural, political, and spiritual upheaval. Industrialization had created rapid change. Empires were shifting, and people were looking for comfort, for something that could offer them security in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Into this fertile psychological landscape came the teachings of figures like John Nelson Darby, who helped popularize what we now call dispensational premillennialism. This was the theological framework that introduced the idea of a two-stage return of Christ, the first being a secret rapture of the church, and the second, a more visible second coming. But here's the question: is that interpretation consistent with the way the early church understood Christ's return? And more deeply, what does it say about our psychological posture towards suffering, responsibility, and faith? When we investigate early Christian texts, what we find is not a preoccupation with being airlifted out of trouble. The early followers of Christ were martyrs. They were persecuted. They were burned alive, thrown to lions, crucified upside down. Yet they didn't expect escape. They expected endurance. They believed that suffering, properly encountered, was transformative. They weren't waiting to vanish. They were preparing to stand. And that's a significant philosophical shift, because if your theology tells you that hardship is something to flee rather than confront, then your soul is trained in avoidance rather than in courage. And that avoidance metastasizes. It leaks into every other part of your life, your relationships, your work, your moral discipline. You begin to assume that God's primary function is to keep you safe rather than to make you strong. That's not Christianity. That's comfort-driven consumerism dressed up in religious clothing. Now let's get back to Scripture. In 1 Thessalonians 4:17, Paul writes that we will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Many interpret this as a secret event, but the Greek word used there for meet, apentesis, was a term used in the ancient world to describe the welcoming of a royal figure into a city. The people would go out to meet the king, not to leave with him, but to escort him back in. It was about reception, not retreat. The point wasn't escape. The point was honor. It was about standing ready when the king returns and taking part in the restoration of the world, not the abandonment of it. This is where our modern interpretation breaks down. We've exchanged the noble, hard-earned discipline of faithfulness for a fantasy of disappearance. We've replaced the gritty, grounded walk of spiritual maturity with a Hollywood-style narrative that promises sudden deliverance without the prerequisite cost. And that's dangerous, not just theologically, but psychologically, because it conditions believers to wait instead of act, to watch instead of build, to expect safety instead of develop strength. Now, why does this matter? Because how you view the end of the story shapes how you live the middle. If you believe you're meant to endure and shine in the darkness, you'll cultivate resilience, wisdom, and a courageous presence. But if you believe you're just biding your time until evacuation, you'll live passively, fearfully, and in constant anticipation of being rescued. And perhaps that's the deeper question here. Are we forming people who are ready to rule and reign with Christ, or are we creating spiritual refugees hoping for a last-minute escape? So, the challenge is simple but not easy. Look at your beliefs. Scrutinize where they came from. Ask whether they are rooted in Scripture or in sentiment. Ask whether they make you strong or simply soothe your fears. and then decide whether you're willing to embrace a faith that requires you to carry your cross, not escape it. The rapture, as it's popularly taught, may comfort the flesh, but the truth, real, ancient soul-forming truth, will awaken your spirit. You weren't meant to vanish. You were meant to stand. Stand with courage. Stand with clarity. And when the King comes, don't be looking up in fear. Be found building something worth reigning over. That's what readiness looks like. Let's examine something most people avoid because it's uncomfortable, the way fear distorts theology, and few places does it do more damage than in the doctrine of the end times. Fear, if left unchecked, becomes the hidden author of what people call truth. It creeps in through emotion, not reason, and once embedded, it begins to shape everything, from how we interpret Scripture to how we live in the world. That's precisely what's happened with the modern view of the rapture. It's not just a theological position. It's a psychological posture rooted in fear of tribulation, pain, and responsibility. And that fear has led to the creation of a doctrine more concerned with flight than with faith. Ask yourself, why do so many Christians gravitate toward a version of the future where they're absent from the hardest parts of history? Why does the idea of a sudden escape appeal so strongly? The answer is simple, though not easy to accept. It's because suffering is terrifying. It threatens everything we cling to, our comforts, our routines, our illusions of control. But here's the core truth: avoidance of suffering doesn't produce virtue. It produces fragility. Historically, the people of God were never promised exemption from hardship. What they were promised was presence. The presence of God in the fire, in the flood, in the wilderness. Think of the Israelites. Were they airlifted out of Egypt? No, they walked. Through plagues, through loss, through wilderness. And think of Daniel. Was he spared the lion's den, or was he preserved within it? Over and over again, the pattern is clear. God doesn't remove his people from the trial. He strengthens them within it. And yet, the modern rapture doctrine has taken a detour. Instead of teaching believers to be overcomers, it subtly teaches them to be evacuees. And that has consequences. It affects how you view the world, how you engage with suffering, how you develop spiritual endurance. If you believe the end goal is escape, then the hard work of moral formation becomes secondary. Why sharpen your character if you're about to disappear? This is where the distortion becomes most dangerous, because it's not just about bad eschatology, it's about compromised discipleship. When you anchor your hope in vanishing rather than in victory through perseverance, you strip your faith of its power. You create passive Christians who wait instead of work, who consume instead of contribute, who hope for escape instead of preparing for impact. Now think about this from a broader psychological lens. What kind of people are we becoming when we build our worldview on the assumption that we won't have to face the world's chaos? We become people who are not equipped to deal with reality. We become people who hand over the stewardship of culture to those willing to fight harder for it, good or evil. That's not spiritual maturity. That's strategic retreat disguised as divine deliverance. Look again at the early church. These were not people looking to avoid persecution. These were people who counted it joy to suffer for Christ. They didn't consider themselves victims of history. They considered themselves participants in a larger story of redemption. They weren't hoping to leave the battlefield. They were determined to win on it. And that brings us to the deeper issue: character. Real Christian character is not forged in safety. It's forged in fire, in the refusal to give up, in the ability to hold on to hope when everything around you collapses. That kind of character can't be microwaved. It can't be downloaded through a motivational podcast. It has to be lived, gritted out, prayed through, cried through, wrestled into being, and most of all, it has to be chosen daily. So, if the modern Christian message is subtly saying, "Don't worry, you won't be here when it gets hard," then that message is anti-growth, anti-responsibility, anti-formation. It preaches comfort when Christ preached the cross. This doesn't mean we abandon hope. Quite the opposite. It means we redefine it. Hope isn't the fantasy of rescue. Hope is the fuel of the faithful. It's the knowledge that no matter how dark it gets, light wins. But that victory isn't handed out cheaply. It comes to those who stand, who build, who love when it's dangerous, who speak truth when it costs something, who carry the weight of obedience even when the world mocks them for it. The rapture, as popularly imagined, an instant escape from trouble, is a distortion not only of Scripture but of spiritual strength. If we're going to live with integrity, we must be willing to question the doctrines that make us soft and embrace the truths that make us strong. The end of the age is not a theater we spectate from the sky. It's a calling we step into with courage. And maybe that's what we've been missing all along. Not a timeline, but a mission. Not a forecast, but a formation. You were not made to disappear. You were made to endure. So the question is, are you preparing to flee, or are you preparing to lead? Because the answer to that question will determine not only how you understand the future, but who you become in the present. When we talk about eschatology, the study of the end times, we often forget that how we think about the future directly affects how we live in the present. And one of the most dangerous distortions within modern rapture theology is the deep psychological complacency it breeds. It presents a narrative that says, you don't need to prepare for hardship, you'll be gone before it hits. But here's the question that pierces through that comforting illusion. What if you're not gone? What if you're meant to stand, not escape? Now let's be honest. Human beings crave certainty. We want clean timelines, predictable outcomes. We want to be able to say, this will happen on this date, and I'll be safe while it does. That's the real psychological root of most end times doctrine today. It's not primarily biblical. It's emotional. It's fear masquerading as faith, and in doing so, it lulls people into spiritual apathy. It tells them that building endurance, character, and discernment is optional because their exit is guaranteed. But reality doesn't cooperate with that fantasy. The world is not becoming less chaotic. It's becoming more unstable, more uncertain, more morally incoherent. And this is precisely the kind of environment where real faith is either forged or lost. You don't get to float above it. You have to face it. And here's the paradox that most don't understand. The more we rely on the idea of being rescued from the world, the less we're prepared to transform it. You can't disciple a culture you've abandoned. You can't influence systems you refuse to engage. You can't be salt and light if your only plan is evacuation. This speaks to a deeper philosophical crisis within the modern Christian imagination. We've lost the will to suffer well. We've lost the theology of long suffering, the dignity of endurance, the glory of perseverance. Instead, we've traded it for a counterfeit, instant deliverance. But this quick fix thinking doesn't hold up in the furnace of real life. It doesn't hold up in a hospital room, or a war zone, or a broken marriage, or a collapsing economy. It breaks under pressure because it was never truth to begin with. It was a coping mechanism. So the challenge then is not just to reinterpret prophecy. It's to reframe our mindset entirely. The early church didn't survive because they predicted the future perfectly. They survived because they were ready, spiritually, emotionally, communally. They had the internal architecture to endure. They had the inner steel to hold the line. And that resilience wasn't an accident. It was cultivated through trials, through worship, through discipline, through commitment to something bigger than personal survival. And we need to return to that. Because if we don't, we are training an entire generation to expect comfort and call it faith. We're telling them to prepare for a parade when Scripture says to prepare for a battle. That's not just bad theology. That's a betrayal of our responsibility as leaders, as parents, as mentors, and as believers. Think about this through a psychological lens. Imagine what happens to the mind when it is constantly fed messages of safety, rescue, and detachment. It stops scanning for real danger. It dulls its sensitivity to evil. It fails to develop coping mechanisms for stress and trauma. In other words, it becomes vulnerable, not strong. That's the irony. The doctrine that claims to protect you actually makes you weaker. It strips you of spiritual armor and replaces it with spiritual anesthesia. Contrast that with someone who is trained to expect hardship, not in a doomsday way, but in a sober, grounded, courageous way. That person doesn't panic when things get dark. They don't unravel when systems collapse. They don't curse God when prayers aren't answered quickly. Instead, they persevere, they adapt, they remain faithful. And because of that, they become leaders, beacons in the storm, and that's what we're called to be. Not escapists, not spectators, but participants, builders, warriors of truth, anchors of stability in a sea of chaos. The world doesn't need more Christians predicting the day they'll disappear. It needs Christians who are present, fully present, in the mess, in the suffering, in the brokenness, offering real hope, not hollow platitudes. So the question isn't, will you be taken before it gets bad? The question is, will you be ready if you're not? Will you have the depth, the clarity, the resilience to stand when others fall? Will you have the courage to speak when truth is dangerous? Will you have the maturity to lead when panic spreads? Because that's what the times demand, not just knowledge, but wisdom. Not just prophecy, but presence. Not just belief, but backbone. The future isn't something to hide from, it's something to rise into. And the only way we do that is by confronting the lies we've been told about ease, about escape, about exemption. Real faith doesn't flinch, it doesn't run, it doesn't negotiate with fear. So stand up, prepare, because the days ahead will test everything you claim to believe. And if you're ready, not only will you endure, you will lead.